I'll be able to find it, but I'm recording at least. It'll be somewhere. I'll see if I can get it onto the website for people. Today we're talking about ethics, which both of you really need some instruction on. Just kidding. Ethics is a tough thing because there's a whole lot of different ways to take ethical questions, and a lot of things to consider as you decide what is the ethical thing to do.
Yeah, there's a whole branch of philosophy that's concerned with ethics, and it's like looks at it from like 10 different dimensions of ethics, and it's just amazing.
Absolutely. And at least that's where he didn't say that explicitly. That's at least part of Dr. Spong's point, is if we only use 10 commandments, we limit the discussion of what is ethical, right? You know my joke about 10 commandments, right? And why we like them so much? It's an easy checklist. Yep, got 9 out of 10 of them right. Just killed that guy, so I'm okay with it. Right? It allows us to get a passing grade without really having to think about things. And ethics is about having to think about things and make decisions and decide sometimes not between the clearly good and the clearly evil, but places that have both good and evil mixed in with them, and you have to decide what to do with all that.
Very few things are purely good and purely evil.
Very few things, and very few of the decisions we make are that way, because I don't know, maybe we have a whole bunch of decisions that are that way. We don't think about them because I clearly don't go down that path road because it's just not the right road, and I clearly go down this one because it is. But there's a whole lot where we have to decide that's not one of those clear paths.
I would like to bring up the discussion about the young ice skater from Russia.
All right.
It is a very complicated problem because did she know? It's hard to believe the story that they accidentally gave her grandfather's medicine. I mean, that's difficult to believe.
Yeah.
But that still leaves that it could have been an adult in her life who gave her the drug. And so should she be punished because the adult did it, but they're really punishing the Russian Federation or whatever they're calling themselves now. It's a very complicated situation.
That's exactly right. And even if she was completely innocent of, does the drug enhance her in some way that then makes it an unfair competition?
Unfair for the rest of the athletes, yes.
Right. Yeah, all of that is tough. And the commentators have been very clear, most of them that I've seen, been very clear that they think that she should not compete, no matter how good she is, because she clearly violated a thing, whether she meant to, whether it was on purpose, doesn't matter. It was clearly violated.
If you look at it that a person has an unfair advantage over all the other people, that would be a simple thing to consider. If they're looking at it, was it deliberate, then that changes the thing, but it still means that all of those other skaters aren't getting what they're due either. And I'm glad I'm not the one making the decision.
Yeah. And what's interesting is hardly a day goes by that we can't find an example like that. The other one that happened this week was the priest up in Phoenix. Did you hear about that?
No.
Priest up in Phoenix at St. Gregory's, where I used to deliver bread on the backside of St. Gregory's, a little thing over there. I've known that parish forever. He's been there for like 20 something years. And when he would baptize a kid, he would say, we baptize you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Because he was looking at himself and the father and the mother and the godparents and the grandparents. We baptize you in the name of. And the word he's supposed to use is I baptize you, meaning Christ baptize you. Because he did that, the parish is saying that all of those baptisms for 20 years are invalid.
And all the other priests who did the same thing. I mean, because other priests have come forward and said, well, we've been saying we also. So it's
Why
not
can't they just say, they're using the royal we? Go ahead, Judy. I'm sorry, I butted in.
No, it's just that you go, it's, if you go strictly by, I mean, the church though is so literal about everything anymore that it's just crazy. But then the Pope can say, well, I didn't look into these sex abuse cases more, and he can get, that just kind of slides right by. So, something that truly was detrimental to people, they don't, it's like, oh, okay, we'll just let that slide because it's according to me, all justice in the world seems to revolve around who has the power and who has the money, and that's who gets to skate by. We don't have a justice system in this country.
Yeah. And especially because it comes down to what's simpler for those people, what's simplest for the church, what's, all of those kinds of things. And making simple rules, 10 Commandment type of rules, is simple, but is it truly that which, as Dr. Spong would say, affirms life, increases love, and shows the potential of being? Many of our decisions are not that, are they? We take the simple route. On one of my Facebook pages, it's called Fans of John Shelby Spong. One of the participants wrote, bear with me here, he said, because I want to give up the theistic God, but if we give up the idea of the theistic God, what are we left with? Because if we're left with too much uncertainty, do we define God out of the equation? Right? And we like certainty. And so we easily do certainty, but when we get into that uncertainty, do we lose God? And I think that's the problem. We take easy God rather than the more challenging. And from, I think, Bishop Spong's point of view, we take the idea of God that's most convenient for us, and which puts what we are and what we do in our best light. And what he's asking us to do is move into the adulthood of our lives, away from just the simple childlike way of doing things, and to take responsibility for the decisions that are around us.
There was a paragraph in Why Christianity Must Change or Die on page 160 that I really, to me, spoke to me about what the whole purpose is of ethics. And it's like, it's what gives us life, what lifts us into wholeness, what enhances being, what introduces us to transcendence, what calls us beyond our limits. Yeah. What do we ultimately value? These questions will force us to search, not the empty heavens, but the depths of our own being for answers. And I was talking to my daughter-in-law one time, and it's like, they absolutely will have nothing to do with the church. And because they think that's where they don't like the whole idea of God that the church introduces and stuff. But she said, what we're teaching our children, who are 6 and 4, is that you just don't hurt other people if you can all avoid it. And that's kind of her golden rule, is you just don't hurt other people if you can help it.
Yeah. But those questions that you asked, which I agree with you, I think those questions are marvelous questions. They're just deep questions to apply in the moment, right? When you're standing at the crossroads and you have to decide which way to go, to decide which way is going to enhance life is not always the easy thing. Which one's going to increase love isn't always the simple thing, because you look at those kids and sometimes the right way to enhance that is to use some sort of punishment, which the kid feels as pejorative, but which from your hand may be increasing the outflow of love. It just doesn't feel like it in the moment, right? So how do you do that in a way that truly is life enhancing for that child, not just the opposite? It's
I think
no,
it comes down to the mantra of St. Francis, choose love.
you keep choosing love, you keep trying.
You
Right.
just, you do your best. And we're all going to make mistakes. None of us are perfect. Not even you, Jim. So
Not even me.
So it's like, we do the very best we can. And I'm reading Brene Brown's newest book, Atlas of the Heart, which I totally highly recommend.
Yeah.
And it goes through all the different emotions that we feel and stuff, and explores all these deep emotions in a scientific deep context and stuff. And I love how it's like what we experience and how we experience and how we interpret it is according to our life circumstances and stuff. But I don't know. I like exploring. I've always liked exploring like what makes us tick, especially me. I love to look at me and go, why did you do that? What? And I think a lot of it's because I've been in therapy most of my life due to my early childhood and stuff. But it's like, what makes me react in a way that I did, and explore that. And then if I want to change that, how do I go about doing that in a way that'll be long lasting? Or if I want to reinforce it, how do I do that? It's just to me, you have to have some kind of self-actualization in there where you actually are able to look at yourself objectively and go, this is what I'm feeling, and how do I act on those feelings?
And I think individually, we don't do that well, but at least we understand it in ourselves, how this decision got arrived at in one way or another. Especially if we do any kind of inward thought process about how we acted throughout a day. I think we have a much harder time doing that with each other. And so it's really easy to apply hard and fast rules on the other person who seems to be thinking, doing, acting in a way that is different than me. Partially because I don't know his or her thought process of why that's morally the place that they have to be in. And I don't know how we help each other to have the type of conversation so we understand some of that. Instead, we often get into arguments about this morality versus that morality.
Well, one of the things she brings up too is just we go into a defensive posture so easily anymore.
Yes, we do.
Maybe it's always been the case. And then it's like people you can tell, you fold their arms, and it's like, you get in and it's very hard to take constructive criticism for people anymore. Ever, I guess. It's like, it's hard. I know somebody that comes at me with something, and it's like, if it's not phrased delicately,
yeah,
it's like it's like, well, not me. I would never do that, but it's like, maybe you did.
Yeah. Even the quote that Bishop Spong used by St. Augustine, which I think I understand what Augustine meant by it, where he goes, we are to love God and do whatever we please. And I think Dr. Spong defined it well when he said that we can do no wrong if love of God is within us. The problem is I've seen a lot of evil saying, God loves you, and so I can do this. And so just calling on the love of God isn't quite right. It's kind of like when he got into the thing about corporal punishment. Parents who use corporal punishment swear that that's the most loving thing they can do for their child in the moment. In spite of whatever kind of research says that's not true, they think that they're being loving in that action. How do we make sure that we're not doing the same thing, believing something that maybe doesn't have the backing behind it that we claim?
It doesn't even have to be corporal punishment. I mean, I would say that parents of the last couple of generations probably struggle a great deal because they have been brought up with certain kinds of thoughts about college and everything else. So they think when they are arguing with their teenager, you shouldn't, just leave and not go to college. You need to go to college. You got to get a job. They think that they are doing this because of their love for their child, and they are doing it because of their love for their child, but they don't understand that in today's world, what they think is true may not necessarily be true.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the problem too, is that there's a generational thing going on right now. Now, I doubt that really happened through the ages because things did not change as quickly as they have been in the last 50 years. But I think that some parents, at least, are so convinced that they know what is right for their child that they, put pressure on that child, that some children are resilient and it doesn't matter what the parents do, but others are not. And it causes a great deal of
Resilient or
pain.
stubborn.
Yeah.
Well, and also that generational thing's been going on forever. I mean, as far back as Plato complained about previous generations also. I know I'm a child of the 60s and the generational thing back then was huge, bigger than it is today. So that generational thing has always been there.
The generational thing has been there, but the society now is different. It isn't just that the generation is different.
Sorry, I think it was that the 60s, it was like we were, it was the time of hippies. It was the time of, there was a huge thing about if you were over 30 and all that good stuff. So it was huge back then. I just remember it being my parents did not at all understand where I was coming from in my world. And they totally did not understand it. And I remember my dad saying, if you go down and become a civil rights activist and stuff, it's like, he was like, he didn't know he couldn't wrap his head around the fact that his daughter was into that so much. And so there was a huge generational thing going on, and it happens in every generation.
I don't think that went on in my mother's generation.
No,
I truly don't.
Want me to give you an example, Pam? I've done hundreds of weddings, probably 700 weddings. And I've learned some things about why the different generations use that institution. Like, for example, I remember this couple coming, they were of my son's generation. They had a 10-year-old and 3 or 4 others, right? So they'd finally gotten a weekend away. Went down to San Diego. They were from Chandler area. Went down to San Diego, and on the way back, they came through Yuma. They saw the little wedding chapel, and Margaret called me up, and I run over there and I do their wedding. Right? They said, "All right, we're ready to do this." They'd been together. They'd made the commitment. They'd had the children that were the product of that commitment, and yet so they have a different relationship to wedding than what we were taught. And so I began to investigate that type of thing. And here's the thing. You know why much of your parents' generation stayed together? when they shouldn't have, right? Because the generation before mine, they were going to stick together no matter what happened. You know why that is? Because my grandparents' generation, the ones who were young parents in the Depression, had a hugely high rate of abandonment, right? Where maybe dad went off to get some job and never came back, right? Huge high. And so my parents' generation made the commitment that we're going to stay together no matter what. So it was a response to something they saw in that generation. You know how my generation responded to my parents' generation? You guys stayed together too often when you should have left each other. And so we left without really trying sometimes. It became really easy for my generation to get divorced, right? To a fault. So our kids, like this couple that I was talking about, they looked at how quickly we divorced and they said, so why get married anyway? And so part of the reason they don't get married is because that's not the highlight of what makes relationship. So each generation solved something they saw in the other generation. It caused a problem going down the line, but they solved something. And if you try to just apply your generation's ideals to another generation, or your culture's ideals to another culture, or your gender, or whatever it happens to be, sometimes you're not using the right criteria for that person you're talking to. What is it that they're seeing, and what is it that they're solving through their actions, their choices? The hard part is that does make that very relativistic. Can all of that be right?
And what is right?
What is right? Well, but that's why we...
For you, it may not be right for my children. It may not be, it's like, I know when my son was very small and I was getting my master's degree, I made sure I took child development classes and everything I could on child rearing and counseling and stuff. So because I knew that you can want to not do to your children what was done to you, but if you don't learn an alternative, then you're going to probably do that in the moment, in the heat of the moment. And it was learning how to not do alternative. It's learning how to look at the world a little different, and also how to set those things in your head so that you do have an alternative to the way things were done in the past. And it's like, that's one of the things I'm grateful for that I have done in my life is that I broke that chain of generational violence with my son. It's like now he's a great father, great husband, an honorable young man, and I never have to worry about how my grandchildren are being raised. And it's because but it takes intent. You have to really, really be willing to put in the work to change, not just say, well, I want to change, but how am I going to change?
Yeah. The hard part about that is that it sometimes pushes against things that we considered very firm something, very firm no's or yeses. Like the question that he asked about, is a breathing cadaver the same as life? Or is it okay for us to give up the sanctity of life in order to let this person who used to be alive slip into the next world? And we sometimes have put a lot of emphasis on just keeping someone alive, but not thinking of quality of life. So any kind of idea of self medically induced suicide is some people just fight it completely, but who gets to choose? And when is it okay? I think those are good questions we have that we're asking right now. There's just not an easy answer, is there?
Well, if you're Catholic, that's because I know the Catholic Church, when I used to walk my dogs when I lived in the apartments down Valley View Road right here. And there's a Catholic church down there. When you walk around, we walk around that Catholic church, there was this big stone thing that was right up against the side of the church, right next to the entrance. And it's essentially, it says, we believe in the sanctity of life from the moment of conception till the natural death.
Yeah, yeah.
And like, that's pretty, that's pretty absolute, you know, and
Yep.
it's that will determine how they vote.
Sure,
It will determine-
absolutely.
I mean,
Well,
that's
and
from the moment of conception till natural death. That's pretty whoa.
that's right. And to take that a bit further, though, because in a legal space, that's been challenged in a number of different ways. And the question of when life starts has a number of different things. The current thing that's being pushed that way in medical ethics is, well, at 6 weeks, there's a heartbeat. And so that's when life begins, because there's a heartbeat. And medical experts are saying that's really not a heartbeat. That's just the flow of maybe proto-heart, but it's not a heartbeat yet. But it sounds like, no, it's not. And so there's always those places of questions, but if you want an absolute, you can always find an absolute. So that's, like the Texas law on abortion was passed because of that 6-week thing. And it's easy in that blinders type of view to then forget what else happens. So if you put the sanctity of life, it says 6 weeks of age, 6 weeks of gestation. What do women do who need abortions and can't? And
Well,
what kind of
that too, Jim, is it's not even about abort. It's like if you're rich, you can always get an abortion. To me,
Yes.
it's just a poor people to abortion.
You are so right, Judy,
It's
so
not
right.
about rich people getting their abortions. They're going to be able to get an abortion no matter what, because they're rich.
Right.
This again comes down to money. It's all about power and money. And
And a
it's
punishment on the poor.
yes,
Mhm.
and if you're a poor woman, then you should, but the hypocrisy and all that has always been, but then once that child's born, it's like, screw them.
Yeah.
Then it's like, we're not going to provide afterlife care. We're not going to provide
Yeah.
for preschool. We're not going to provide for education or health care for that child. We're not going to provide food for that child, housing for that child.
Right.
It's like, there's so much, it's like, we just, sorry, this is all, it gets, to me, societal norms come down to politics more often than not.
Very often, very often.
Well, there's another side of that too, is that once these children are born, then the wealthy or educated people say, why do those families have so many children?
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
would be able to pull themselves out of poverty if they didn't have so many children. It's so contradictory. And the fact is, sanctity of life goes two ways. Well, how about the sanctity of life of the mother and the
Right.
and the potential siblings of that whatever? There's sanctity of life, but then that should be sanctity of all life.
Yeah. And the other corollary to all this is who gets to make the decision about all that. Should society be dictating when it's the right choice, or who's close enough to the situation and has the expertise to make that decision? I believe it's the doctor and the woman involved,
Yeah.
not the legislature that passes a law. That to me is an ethical question, and where I sit on that It has nothing to do with whether I think it's a good or a bad choice in this particular case. It's who should make the decision.
Well, one of the things we found in Africa is that they have so many children because they know that a lot of them are going to die.
Yeah.
And so they have so many children because they know that they're hoping at least one or two of them will survive, because they don't have pensions or anything. Their children are going to take care of them in their old age.
Right.
And so they want at least one or two of them to survive.
Right.
It found that if I listened to Bill Gates the other day, who is not one of my favorite people, but he does do a lot of good in the world. And he does do a lot of research and stuff. And they found that once, like, child deaths went from 10 million to 5 million over a decade. And that's like still 5 million children dying, but it's half.
Yeah.
And found that the families were actually having fewer children when their children survived more. And that's just a fact. So you get into things that it's like we don't look at things rationally, or we don't look at research and how we make our laws. You know, it's so it's like you politicize everything anymore. And
Yeah.
And I look at, like, I have a friend whose nephew that she raised got into was charged with something recently that was innocent of, but he accepted a plea deal of 6 years in prison, even though he was innocent, because if it had gone to trial, the lawyers told him he only had a 10% chance of succeeding and not getting 60 years. So even though he's innocent, and this happens constantly, and the plea deals are the norm now. Very few things actually go to trial anymore because they plea deal. And there's so many innocent people in prison who accept plea deals because the thought of going to prison if you look at 60 years versus 6 years, what do it's like, well, even though I'm innocent, I better take this, because if I don't, I'm probably going to end up 60 years. That breaks my heart. It's sad.
Yeah. The hard part is that it's hard for any of us to look at the largest picture, right? We all overlook things, especially the inconvenient ones that make us have to rethink the choices we make. And yet that's what ethics is about choosing to think deeper about things than just taking the easy route. Don't just take the 10 commandments. Do you know how many commandments the Jews see in the Old Testament?
It's a lot more than 10.
613.
Yeah. That was interesting too. There's 3 different versions of the 10 commandments.
Yeah, and I think there's actually 4. The other one is the one that's in Leviticus. He didn't mention that because it's not quite as clearly 10 commandments. Many of them are the same. But that's beyond the point, that there's just a whole lot of different commands. Which of them are applicable in any particular moment, right? The do not harvest to the edges of your field commandment isn't one that affects me on a regular basis these days, unless I take it metaphorically and somehow.
That one's a good one.
Yeah. Right.
Let the poor people glean from your field.
Right. So the hard part is that it's just so easy to make it simple, and that's rarely helpful. We use that to be able to define people out of the equation. When I was growing up, all my Protestant friends who knew I was Mormon, oh, you guys are the ones that have more than one wife. Well, that was just a really easy way to define someone out of the norm. Although polygamous marriage is pretty much a norm in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Right. And So why aren't we seeing that as a norm that we can continue today? Well, because we figured out different sets of norms to be able to hold up. But we use those as clubs against each other so often, don't we?
We use them as clubs against each other. And I think that what they do is they give us a shortcut. We don't have to think.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that there's a lot of people who want to have everything cut and dried. They don't want to have to think. They don't want to have to decide whether something is good or bad or middle of the road or whatever.
Mhm. And I think it comes down to a couple of different things. One of them is just trust. Do I trust you to make decisions? And the answer, sadly, is no, we really don't. And with a lot of really good reasons why we don't trust each other. Right? Because we're not always the best decision makers in
Maybe
each other's eyes, especially.
some people don't trust themselves to make good decisions.
Maybe. And this is a way to rein themselves in or something. Yeah.
But then we have make these decisions, and they're more often than not politicized. And courts, these are people. They're not. I mean, they've got their own biases, their own. It's like, and it still comes down to money and power.
It does. Yeah. But the hard part about trust is it also means that I have to relinquish control over some part of society. I have to decide that group of people get to make a decision that's different than what I would make. Right? But when I look at like those weddings that I did, I learned long ago that there's not a perfect definition of how to make a marriage work. There's a lot of definitions of how to do it wrong, in fact, right? But there's also a whole lot of definitions of how to do it right. And if I say, unless you do it this way, you don't get to, you don't get to define yourself as marriage. What have I done? I remember I did a wedding for a man named Mike and for Phyllis, his bride. And at the end, one of his buddies said, "Hey, where's the marriage license? Let's sign the marriage license." Now, Mike and I knew that this was a covenant marriage and that we weren't going to sign a marriage license. Why? Because if they had gotten married legally, suddenly their pensions got all mixed up and they lose things. So they were making a decision very purposely to commit themselves to love, to stand in front of their friends in order to make that commitment, but not worrying that it wasn't going to be a legal thing. Was that ethically right or wrong? Well, in the view of the man who was saying we got to sign the license, he knew the right answer, the legal answer. But was it the ethical answer? And when we set up laws, we think that means ethics. So what do we do about all this? I think the other thing besides trust is us stepping into adulthood as individuals and as communities, stepping into the responsibility of not just trusting a simplistic definition of where truth comes from, but being in the midst of where we are daily working to find that, and me being responsible for the world around me and choosing to make decisions in that world, not just trying to force the world to make my decisions, but choosing how to interact with it. But responsibility and trust, those two elements, don't always come easy to us, do they?
Mm-hmm.
No matter how much we think we're growing up.
I like this other sentence in the book, unbelievable, where he says, "The ethical life has always been an adventure."
It's always been. Yeah, I love that one too.
It's not something that's hard and fixed. Things change and I mean, we learn things, we change, it's not just a fixed line. And that it's like it's like people, when people say, do you believe in God? I always go, well, how do you define God? It's like, it's all relativistic in some ways, but you have to be able to think and question deeper than just where things look like they're going to fit. Like really, if you, and learn everything you can about like what's going to, I don't know, look at it from all sides and get as much information as you can on it. But we can't do that in every situation. So that's why we have courts and a whole system out there that's supposed to
help with it.
Help with that. But then I look at things like our current Supreme Court, and it's like, it's all political. It's like they just struck down a law that's going to make it a lot easier for Rosemont Mine to start in on the other side of the Rincons, which is absolutely going to break my heart. I used to camp in that area, and I want to be part of a monkey wrench gang for the future when they start mining, over there, because, and I just am like, why are people in Tucson not more upset that they're going to start doing this deep pit mine just right here on our doorstep? And it's like, that's a passion of mine, but obviously it's not a passion of everybody. So what, I don't know, it just gets to where it's a matter of doing harm to the earth and to each other.
Yeah. And the hard part is, Judy, is that we make decisions like that because we put value on different things. You put the value on earth, someone else is putting the value on what's inside of the earth that can help. And I'm putting the best spin possible on this. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
They're putting the value on extracting that which will give something important to humankind. I think it's a lesser value. I think it's a profit-based value, and so it is ethically not as a compelling a case for me. But I think the really hard thing is we just don't always look at the other side very well. In the abortion debate that we were talking about, the really tough part about that is that if we look at Kohlberg's scale of moralistic values, both sides of the abortion debate are very high values. The problem is it's usually presented as one high and one low, right? Why? Because then it's much easier to espouse my thing at the expense of the other person, right? I believe in life, and so you're completely wrong because you don't. Well, you can debate whether this is a high value or, as high value as yours, but they're both really high moralistic values that are being held there. And that's why that debate is so difficult. And yet we write each other off in questions like that too often.
Well, when Jesus performed his miracles on the Sabbath, and then he was criticized for it, and then he said, well, which is better? And I think that that's something to be looked at too. Again, you might have you have a good value on one side, you should be obeying the Sabbath. But on the other side, if you can save a person's life, even if it's on the Sabbath, that's also good. So again, you have two things of high value here that are ethical decisions.
Right. And at least one other way to be able to measure it is the do no harm, do good. Have you heard that? Right? What is it that's causing harm, and what is it that's doing good in the world? And that's not a perfect way of solving it, because it's pretty simplistic, but at least it's better than you just can't kill no matter what.
Yeah.
Right? Because on things like killing, we all kill in one way or another from somebody's point of view, right? On the abortion question, liberals tend to be the killers, if you will, and conservatives tend to be the non-killers. But it shifts when you get to something like capital punishment, right? So we all find places where we take a course of action that we might use the same commandment in our mind to be able to take this action in one case and this action, opposite action in another. And we all do it because ethics is not a clear-cut, simple set of choices, no matter how much we try to make it into one. And maybe more importantly, no matter how much we need to we try to force someone else into the simplistic that I think it is. I wish it was simple to figure all this out. The good news is I trust 2 out of 3 of the people in the room. Not saying who or the other one. You know, it's hard to trust everyone, but I think that if we can choose to try to, that goes a long way, doesn't it? We have about 5 minutes left. So tell me some of the places where you are trying to figure out an ethical space.
When I went to Borneo and saw all of the palm plantations there that had taken away the natural habitat of the orangutans, I was appalled. And since then, I've tried to avoid palm oil, anything with palm oil, and it's very difficult to do that. So I was looking up something this morning because I thought that palm oil really is not good for humans to ingest. Now, that being said, they use it for all other kinds of things, lubricants and stuff like that, that is not being ingested. But I found this one article that was actually from the Palm Oil Sustainable Council or whatever. And they were saying, one of the comments that they made was, well, the orangutans use the palm plantations to move from one part of their forest to the other part, and sometimes they even feed there. Now, they forget that the orangutan's forest was one complete area, that they didn't have to go through this bad area to get to it. On the other hand, if we actually need to use the palm oil in some things, do we want to use have them from the Sustainable Palm Oil Council? I had heard, I don't know, probably a month or so ago from somebody on the Zoom that I do with the Washington DC group on Mondays that Unilever was a really good company. And so I went and looked on their website, and on it, it talked about that they get their palm oil for their beauty products and stuff from sustainable palm oil forests. And my first response was, if you used a different oil, that would cut down on the need for more palm oil plantations. Even though yours is sustainable, it would cut down on it. Because my big fear now is, I mean, they practically destroyed Borneo. What are they doing to the Amazon now? And so it's like,
and I've seen
okay, you've got a sustainability people over here saying, we're not bad, we're not bad. And other people saying, well, it doesn't matter anyway. And then you have the environmentalists to say, you know, we got to get rid of it all completely. Well, you know, human beings do need to live in the world. So it's very complicated.
Well, and things like deforestation of the rainforest, you know, like Pastor Victor down in Pucallpa, they live right in the forest. They've got a little place they call Quince, right? And that was clear cut at some point earlier and then they were able to buy it. So they've been trying to plant trees. The trees haven't planted well, you know, because that soil is not the richest of soil without all the nutrients falling from it. And so I'm trying to figure out how to, you know, oftentimes the people deforesting places are people who need a job. And this company that sent them in there, you know, is paying them a good wage in order to sustain their family. And so ethically, I see why the person takes that job. The company exploits them. And if I take away my support of that company, how do I hurt the worker? And so ethically, I have such a hard time in those types of areas.
And also, some of the rainforest has been deforested because they were originally taking the lumber out. And so
Yeah.
now they're putting the palm plantations in there, which not many animals in that environment make use of. Now, it's
Yeah.
possible that they may learn to make use of the palms, I don't know, but they are putting something in, so it's not bare earth. I mean,
Yeah.
it's really, it's not as simple as I originally thought. And so that's what I'm saying. This is truly an ethical dilemma.
Yeah. And I think what you have to do as much as possible is think hard about it, make a decision, but then do two other things. Keep yourself open to new information. Because I think sometimes if we make a decision, we sometimes just say, no matter what.
Yeah, yeah.
I think you're on shaky ethical grounds when you say no matter what.
Yeah.
But also be open to somebody else making a different decision than you, and not instantly decry it as a bad decision because it wasn't your decision. That's tough to do.
Yeah.
Especially if you thought about it well, then you think you have the right answer. But maybe it's not the only answer.
Or you live in a society that makes doing something that you really would rather do extremely hard. Like I would rather not buy from Amazon, but it's with my health issues and not driving, it's oftentimes that's the only option I have.
Well, during
Yeah.
COVID, it was a lifesaver.
It was
Yeah.
a life.
And just things like knowing about there's 3 big meat packing companies, and stuff. I'd really like to be vegetarian again, but it's not healthy for me to do that and it's not easy to do that. And so how do you, there's so many ways in which you wish you could choose an easier way, but it's oftentimes not something it would be so hard to do it that it's just
Yeah.
almost impossible.
Yeah, I thought about like during COVID too, how our use of plastic products
Yes.
rocketing. Why? Because we wanted to do single use, and so we didn't pass on. I get all of that, but at the same time, man, that has such ethical implications on this earth, dangerous implications. So what do we do, and how do we get ourselves unhooked from that? Even though it was maybe the right decisions for the past couple of years, how do we move towards better decisions as we move forward?
Well, I know people who put down the idea of situational ethics because they say ethics are ethics. It doesn't matter on the situation. And that's not true. It does matter on the situation.
Yeah. I think that's what ethics actually is situational. The problem is that means that you are going to look at it differently than me, and you're going to apply situation in a way that's not mine. And that's what they're really saying. Don't come to a different conclusion than me. That's using situational ethics. No, that's just using it differently than what you use it.
Yeah.
The tough part about ethics is like you said, Judy, it is a huge field because there's so many enormous questions, so many ways to look at it. But I think it's some of the most important discussions we have if we choose to have them and not do like Bishop Spong was really working against. We use a simplistic way to be able to do it. We don't just say, here's the 10 rules that you have to follow no matter what. That's not ethics. That's stubbornness. Real ethics is choosing to be relational to the situation as well as to the people in it. And that's hard work. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Jim, and get better.
I will. I'm hoping that it'll be fixed up soon. Pam, and I'll get back with you to try to figure out what we're doing with 745.
Okay.
So, all right.
Well, if
And
you
also
need me
what
to
we're-
read a Bible verse or something like that, I can do that. And I don't know if Wendy's coming, but the two of us could probably do that. I don't know whether we can get a discussion started or not, but
Yeah, we can figure out, we'll figure out something somehow.
all right.
All right.
Good,
Take
good
care.
to see you, Judy.
You too, Pam.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.